inviting me to come along today. There's two things that Ranjan and I have in common. Well, there's quite a few others, but the first is we both love commercial property. So I was really excited about coming along today to talk about commercial property. The second love we have is about classic cars, a particular brand of classic car, but we'll come into that later. What I didn't know at the time when I volunteered to come and share my journey around commercial property was that I was going 6 rounds against Susanna Cole, who is a powerlifter who probably throws men the size of me across the ring just for fun. But I'm glad we're friends. I'll give you a brief background about myself and my property journey, and then I'll talk about why I shifted over to commercial property and why I think now, for me, and for hopefully many of you in the room today, you'll start to look at commercial property in a different light, because the shift for me was quite important, because now everything I look at is commercial, but either with a resi angle or with a commercial angle. And I'll give you an example before I kick off with delay, just to kind of try and get you to think about commercial property differently. Now, does everybody in the room drive a car? Well, most of you drive a car. So if you drive a car, to you and I, it's a family car. It might be for work, it might be to take your family, maybe to the weekends, or to go shopping. But to somebody that uses that car for their business, who is a taxi driver, a courier, that works perhaps 8 hours a day, it's a source of revenue. That same car hasn't changed. If that person, that driver, male or female, then uses the same car and rents it out to somebody else whilst they're asleep, they're leveraging that car. The asset hasn't changed, but the income has, because another driver is using it rather than it sitting in the driveway or the car park. And then if that person gets a fleet of cars and gets everybody else to do the driving for him or for her, that gives you leveraged income. So when I look at commercial property, I actually don't look at it as commercial property, I look at it as an asset. And I think that's where my background in marketing gives me a slightly different perspective. And I want you to go away today with a different perspective to every property that you look at, whether it be residential or commercial. Commercial's going to win today, but I want to the big takeout is I want you to look at commercial property differently. So my background is in corporate marketing, and I became a full-time investor by accident in 2009 because I went over to the Middle East, and that was with the credit crunch. The jobs that I was supposed to go and work on got cut, the contracts didn't get renewed. So I came back in 2009 to the UK and thought, what do I do now? Do I go back into corporate marketing, which is the first budget to get slashed by most companies and PLCs, or do I make my part-time business, which at that time was property investing, my full-time business? The difference was I had to replace my income. So I needed a cash flow, or a heavy cash flow strategy, which residential property can do if you buy, develop and sell, or you rent out, but yield doesn't give you enough cash flow to live on, unless you adopt some tactics that Susanna talked about and you're buying below market value. So that was kind of my first entry into thinking about commercial property. So I run a property investment company, and I also work with 3 other partners, and we run a property development company which specialises on buy, develop and sell. So this was the overview, the state of the nation, if you like, that I wanted to sort of run through. Ranjan's going to sort of go into this in more detail to summarise, but what's the state of the market? How does residential and commercial regulatory environment differ? How does it get more complicated in essence, really? What offers the best return? And I'll talk a little bit about what I believe offers the best return and how you can maximise return from commercial property. How easy to get started in residential and commercial? I would actually argue that commercial property now is easier to get started, but I'll come on to that a little bit later. And tax considerations and benefits, I'll let Ranjan talk about that, all the sort of, the horrible stuff, as I call it. Because as entrepreneurs, you've got to start your business, expand your business, have an understanding of tax and regulatory considerations, but don't let it become an obstacle. and how not to lose your shirt. That applies to any business really, not just residential or commercial property. So 6 3-minute rounds with Susan about the landscape of why I think commercial is more favourable and how the shift towards commercial is becoming better. So there's Brexit uncertainty, there's stamp duty hikes, it costs you a lot more now to buy residential property as an investor. Tax release on mortgage interest has gone. I've gone, back in 2009 when I was kind of investing full time, you'd get buy-to-let mortgages, the stress tests were different. Now they're wanting 145% rental cover. At that time it was 110 to 125%, depending on how you structured your business. I want to share some of the reasons behind my passion and enthusiasm for commercial property. The last point, timing is right now. That's really important because how many high street brands and shops are moving away from the high street? Now we've got, I think there's 3 or 4 companies last week. I think Moss Bros had some bad results. There was Maplins that are now closing down from the high street. There's Toys R Us that thought we're going to the retail park and set the brilliant strategy in retail parks, and now because of online shopping, everyone's moved away from retail parks. So, what's the next strategy? So timing is really important because when I got into full-time investing developing in 2008 and 2009, commercial property was kind of getting to the bottom of its price to acquire. Now you don't have to own commercial property to make money from it in the same way you don't have to buy a car and own it to make money from it. You can lease a car, whether it's a van, you can do if you're a small SME trader or a small business owner, you can lease a vehicle. If you're a taxi driver, you can contract hire a vehicle and you can make money from it without having to own it. So if you apply that logic to commercial property, just think out the box a little bit, because if you're buying a residential property like Susanna says, you've got to have a massive deposit. But you don't always need a big deposit with commercial property. Now this is the other thing that's moved me away from residential property. I'm not going to go through all the points, but standards and demands of residential clients, as we call them, has changed. They're a lot more demanding, and it's starting from students. Now, I used to be a student, and I love my student life, but I used to live in grotty old Victorian houses where the windows were broken, you had to kind of self-fix them. Now, students are leaving purpose-built, glorified towers with communal bars, and, it's just a different landscape. And people are going on holiday and staying in Airbnb accommodation. People who've got houses, who've got spare room, have done their spare rooms better than the house that the rest of their house, because they've realised they can earn a revenue from it. In turn, Airbnb has actually caused budget accommodation providers like the Premier Lodges and Travel Inns to up their game. I mean, if you're meeting somebody for coffee in a business meeting in Birmingham or Manchester or Leeds and you decide to meet halfway on the motorway, you can go into one of the Premier Lodges and they've got fantastic facilities. They're advertising on TV because they've increased their services, the rooms are better, the parking is great, so they've really improved their standards. So really, you don't have to go to an expensive hotel to benefit from great facilities anymore. And in the same way, I think that as a residential landlord or landlady, you've really got to up your game. Tenants are on the phone all the time, they expect you to respond to app-based software because that's what they're now growing up with. And there's lots of technology out there that makes things easy, but you've got to keep a control on cost. It's great having apps to outsource the fact that the drain is blocked, but that's no different to somebody calling an emergency plumber. You've still got to keep a control on all of your costs. Landlord legislation, landlady legislation, HMO licensing, Section 24, incorporation, to incorporate or not to incorporate. It's just such a big headache. So I want to give you an example. I invest typically with residential property in zone, sort of borders of zone 1 and zone 2. So I'm going to share an example that's zone 2 specific. So for those of you that aren't London-based, Zone 2 is kind of the second circle around the tube map. Is anybody not in London? Do you want to expand on Zone 2? It's literally sort of, if you go to Victoria, that's Zone 1. Battersea, Clapham, Wandsworth, Putney, those areas are all classed as Zone 2. So very central. Now, I'll come on to some of the examples, but I want to share some numbers because we're all business people in the room. So, let me just see if there's a pointer. Is it the... Oops. Is it the red one? Oh, okay. So, we've got some commercial offices around Clapham, Kensington, Putney, and we typically get rents of about £30 to £40 per square foot. So one of the big shifts for me was not talking about bedrooms, it's not talking about lounge or kitchens, it's about square foot. Because somebody says, oh, I've got an amazing 3-bed flat for you in Earl's Court. It means nothing to me, absolutely nothing, because if it's in Earl's Court, it could have been chopped. So you've got bedrooms that are the size of a floor tile. You've got no way of... Whereas if somebody says to me, I've got an 800 square foot apartment in Earl's Court, and it's being sold at £1,000 a square foot, I know, regardless of going out and seeing it, that once I know the street, I'll know what the exit price is, because I can factor in the development cost as a square foot. So I'd kind of, in a way, suggest that you become comfortable or get to know price per square foot. So most people, if they're buying or renting a one-bedroom apartment, it tends to be 500 square feet. If it's a micro apartment, it'll be a bit less, 380 square feet. But when you're buying an apartment, it's like buying a car. I want to go and buy a car. What does that mean? You have a budget, but if you're buying a second-hand car, are you buying a Ford Focus or are you buying a second-hand 1 Series BMW? It doesn't have any clarity around it. So we talk about square foot because it doesn't matter if the building is 2,000 or 15,000 square feet. So in commercial property, the tenant pays all the service charges, all the maintenance, all the repairs, and all the insurance. I'm going to speed up a little bit here because it's been flagged, but rental income typically is similar, £30 a square foot in Zone 2, in Clapham, in Battersea, in Wandsworth, but the landlord or landlady has to pay the service charges, which are typically around £2,000 per annum, up to £3,000 if you've got concierge and a lift, maintenance charges, repairs and insurance. So really, you might be receiving £30 a square foot. So let's say it's a 500 square foot apartment, it's £500 a week, it's £25,000 a year. Off that £25,000 a year, the landlady or landlord is losing £3,500 to £4,000 a year, which equates to a rental of being closer to £22 to £26 a square foot. That's a big difference. 8 over 40 is 20%, if you're getting the higher end of £40 a square foot. Now, in terms of my portfolio, the reason I started to invest more in commercial property is that at the moment, my commercial portfolio makes up about 15% of my portfolio. But in terms of revenue, income, I'm getting 25% revenue from 15% of my portfolio. My target is to grow my revenue to 50% by increasing my commercial portfolio to 25%. I don't want to go all commercial because there are some inherent risks and you've got to manage risk and reward. But I think that's, for me, quite a comfortable position. Now, this is really interesting because I want to try and change your perceptions a little bit around what is a commercial property. So, the property I'm going to show you is a commercial property, and it comes with a 15-year lease. Now, in the residential market, everyone runs a mile when you talk about a short lease. But note the difference here. It's renewed every 15 years, automatically with no premium. That's a really important... People look on Rightmove. Who would buy a residential property with a 15-year lease? Nobody, because you can't get a mortgage on it, you've got to put all your money in. If it falls below a certain level, then you don't actually have the rights to renew it. There's all sorts of complications. It's all to do with legals. Unless you're a legal expert, I stay away from very short leases. Short, 60 years is fine, but really short? But this property is really interesting because not only does the lease get renewed with no premium, because it's 15 years, nobody's looking at it. Everyone's switched off from that property and it's a commercial property. There is a catch that there is a ground rent of £53,000 per annum. Fine, just park that in your mind for 1 second because that's 100% offsettable as a business expense. So you can be in this property, pay that ground rent, but if you're making, it comes off your profit bottom line. In addition, now this is amazing, this property I'm about to show you doesn't pay business rates. So if you're a business owner and you want to be in Zone 1 in Belgravia, Knightsbridge, how can you be exempt from business? It's because of the way that the lease is worded and set up originally. Now, if it was rented to a commercial tenant, you could achieve roughly £60 a square foot, which is, I'm being cautious there. Now I'm going to show you the commercial property. It's this house here. Half of it actually goes into this building. And this is the interior. Does that look like a commercial property? But in the same way that the differentiator between live-work and work-live space has changed, if you now work from your bedroom at home with a laptop, does that make it a business premises? Going back to that car example, when I drive my car, I'm using it for social domestic pleasure. When I get into the same car that's driven by a professional paid driver, he or she is a taxi driver in the same car. But it's the same asset. This is all about the lease, because where this property is located, it's in an area that's controlled by, you'll have Grosvenor Estates or the big landlord or landlady companies that own lots. But it's a residential property. Now that's the only bit there that gives it away a little bit. But that's like somebody's bedroom, having a desk and a mezzanine level. That's the kitchen area. That's another view of the kitchen area, or living space. That's the bathroom. Does any of this look like a commercial property? And yet, if you were to even rent in that area, you'd actually be paying more in rent for a residential property, given that you've got all of these tax benefits. But I know some of these tax benefits have to be worked out, you've got to sit down, but you have to do that with residential property today as well. So in the ring with residential property, it's not like it was before, where you buy something, put a small deposit down, you've got to know about tax, you've got to know about regulation, you've got to know about all the licensing. It's a minefield. So I know I'm short of time. This property is actually my hometown, and I'm happy to kind of talk about some of the stuff I've done, but I thought this would be really interesting to see the stuff that I'm looking at and why I'm looking at it. So the stuff that Ranjan has seen in Putney, in Battersea, in Clapham that I get involved with, it's all got high ceilings, because I like to put in mezzanine levels, because I don't pay for airspace if you put in a mezzanine level. But if you put a mezzanine level, put in desks and partition it well, you make it, people talk on the residential development side about airspace developments, which we also do, but this is an airspace development. Now this is a cinema, so what do you have? Massive ceiling heights. You've got 2 screens, but 2 floors with 2 screens. It's huge. The price per square foot for this cinema, now the reason it's actually available is because they've got a new super complex that's being built in the town at the other side of, the same town, which is fine, great. But, there's lots of, so when people say, well, what is it? What can you do with it? It's got to have a leisure use. Why has it? Look at it in the same way that a car is a car or a taxi. Look at the asset and look at what else. For me, what I'm looking at is, can we get a retail space on the ground floor because it's such a prominent position? And can we actually get some fantastic office space upstairs? or maybe it could be some amenity space. So we're looking at what isn't there in that area that we could benefit from. This is another building. What you can't see from the picture is it's actually directly opposite, and this is the old library. Now look at that. Now both of these buildings have a capital value, meaning a purchase per square foot, of around £60 to £80 per square foot. To put that into context, apartments in that town centre area are probably double or triple that. So appreciate, yes, you've got to spend some development money, yes, you've got to be creative, yes, you've got to think outside the box, but you're buying these beautiful big buildings at a fraction. It's like saying, you know when you lease a car, this is the kind of example, if you lease a BMW or a Mercedes from a contract hire company, and you get a great job as a new salesperson, and you think, why he's driving around in a BMW, he's only just started the job. It's because leasing rates on cars that hold their residual value mean that the cost per month is lower. So it's lower for the company to rent a BMW or a Mercedes for their employees than it is to, say, rent another car that's made perhaps by a main market manufacturer like Peugeot or Ford. And that's why, because the cars might have the same list price, but one keeps its value better. So really it's about how you can add value, because when they're empty, they have very little value as a commercial property, but it's about being creative. Now, this is the development literally opposite both that cinema and the library. And if big companies are spending so much money on more infrastructure and for lots of research and development, I'm pretty comfortable offering on these sort of buildings where I'm now getting such a low entry point. So I'm going to, I'll probably leave these out for now because I think we're running short of time. This was I'll talk about it very quickly. This was an office building that we bought in Clapham. I guess the takeout here is that when I looked at this, my first takeout wasn't, why has this been empty for 2 years? My takeout was, wow, what a beautiful building. Potentially 1 apartment, 2 apartments, 3 apartments, worst case scenario. It's 2,500 square feet now, it was 2,000 when I bought it, and we put in mezzanines. You can't really tell from the picture here, but we put in mezzanine floors which give us usable square footage. I've got some other examples, but I'll just whiz through to my summary if I may. Some final thoughts why I think commercial property is the way to go. So when I said earlier, you don't have to own a property. If you see an empty shop on the high street, don't think that it's an empty shop because the business person couldn't run it well. Maybe things have changed, but what can you do with that empty shop? You don't have to buy that shop, you could lease that shop. So people talk about rent to rent. So if you're in an area and there's no creche, or there's no coffee shop, or whatever it might be, do your research, find out what that area lacks. And you can actually take a lease in the same way that you can have a residential rent to rent. You can rent that property for a given point in time, so 5 years or 10 years, as long as you have confidence in your own abilities and you're actually going to do something creative with it. Transform that shop, whether it's transform it to an office space. So in the old days, they used to have architects and insurance companies on the high street. They've gone, but who's to say that they can't come back? If you then transform that space, you create goodwill. Which once, say you've taken an empty shop, it's got no goodwill, but if you run it well, within a year or 2 years, you've got some accounts, you can show there's trading. If it's a coffee shop, you can show records. Then another coffee shop provider may decide to come in and think, oh, fantastic, we've got a ready-made business here that we can enhance. They will pay you goodwill for taking on that lease. And you can then rent it out as a going concern, benefiting from the additional rental uplift. How good is that? You don't even own the building. Now, I'm not saying this is right for everybody, but you can't really do that with a residential property. Somebody else owns it. Even if you have a rent-to-rent 3-year agreement with the landlord or landlady, they could turn around and, cancel you've spent £5,000 on, upgrading the furniture, kitting out the rooms. With commercial property, if you bought it empty as a shell and you've spent money on it, you've still got that lease. You're protected. And as long as you can do a sublet, so check the lease terms, get your lawyers to look into it, there's no reason you can't get an uplift. And you could do multiple commercial deals because the high streets are suffering at the moment. Not because they're not great places to be, but because people aren't being creative with what else that asset could be utilised for. So that's our office. It's been great speaking to you. I hope that you'll sort of back for the commercial corner. And if you've got any questions, please feel free to connect with me at the break. I'll pass you over to Renda.
Floors and short tenants can work wonders for maximising floor space. Okay, I'm just going to do a quick little some market commentary, if you like, on the commercial space. The commercial arena. And this is inspired by a little email. Now, one of the things I do, I run a little mentoring mastermind group for people interested in doing commercial property and commercial development projects. And one of the guys on the program is doing his first commercial deal. And he's just about to exchange contracts, and he receives this email from his solicitor. This is a solicitor he's known for a long, long time, and he's saying, because he's cut his teeth in buy-to-let residential. That's his background. He's known his solicitor for years. He's doing his first commercial deal. He's about to exchange contracts, and his solicitor sent him this email, which he sent me a copy of. I've received the last bit of your stuff from the seller. However, I feel I should just check with you that you feel sure that now is a good time to proceed with a retail investment property in the light of the very bad news from retail parks and high streets following the BHS in 2017, where all or many of the units owned by the following are closing. And you can see a right long list of Toys R Us, Macklin, New Look, Byron's, Burgers, Carluccio's, Clezos, and all of these sort of people. I just thought that I would put this pessimistic view to you before it's too late. Very helpful solicitor, isn't it? So, he sent this email to me, and I thought it was nice, actually, that the solicitor was giving him that 11th hour tip. But I love this, because when the mainstream media jumps at headlines, and what you've always got to do is look behind the headlines and understand what the driving forces are. If you understand what the driving forces are, you can identify the opportunity. And that's what I wanted to kind of take you through, how I'd respond to an email like this. Now, the first thing is that if you have a two-bedroom flat in Clapham, and I let it to someone who gets made redundant, I haven't got a duff property. I've got a tenant whose business model for earning an income has just not worked for whatever reason. The property itself is sound. It's a similar thing to what Anne was saying, in that it's the way an asset is used as opposed to necessarily the user. So we all know that the trend nowadays is that a lot of products that used to be sold in high street shops are now being sold online. But there's some things that it's still not possible to do online. I haven't figured out how to cut my hair online, and I haven't figured out how to have a cup of coffee online, are two simple examples. Now you can see these trends backed up by real data. Now this is a fascinating graph from the FT. Segro is one of the largest owners of out-of-town warehouses in the UK. And Hammerson is one of the largest UK shopping centre owners. They own Into, and they own Lakeside, and those sort of, they're the largest shopping centre operator. Now, what's interesting is to look at their share performance, because share price is based on future earnings. You see that the group that owns the shopping centres, the share price has gone down. But the one that's got these mega warehouses, for the like that sort of Amazon use, their share price is going up. So there's obviously a trend there, a real underlying trend that can be backed up with data, in that physical product is a little bit more challenging to sell from a retail sort of high street outlet. There's another thing that people haven't really picked up on, is why so many chains are failing. Now, with the advent of cheap money, a lot of these, particularly these what they call the casual dining sector, the Prezos and the like, they've all gorged on debt. And they've gorged on bond debt. They've issued lots of bonds. The interest rates have been high. The problem is those bonds are now coming up where they have to repay the capital. And for a whole bunch of issues, a lot of these chains haven't had the turnover growth that they were expecting in order to pay back the bonds at their maturity. So there are other underlying factors behind these store failings, which are not really, they're only in the specialist media. This was reported in the FT again. But the headline media is all, oh, these shops are failing, this is failing, that is failing. But you've got to understand the reasons why a tenant with a particular business model is not making it work on that site. Because it's very rarely the actual property that's a problem. It's often the occupant not having the right business model. So what it's about finding the right business model. There's a big trend at the moment now that all these so-called casual dining restaurants are failing. I mean, Jamie Oliver opened up this Italian restaurant, and last year he blamed Brexit for falling turnover. It's crap food, high price and low service, that's it. And he's not even Italian, which doesn't really help if you're serving Italian food. The thing, I mean, our office is in St Albans, and St Albans is a lovely city with tons of eateries, and all these chains are there. What I find fascinating is that on the high street there are two family-run, independent Italian restaurants, and they're packed. You have to reserve for lunch on a Wednesday. I'm serious. Prezos, 100 feet away, empty. Why? Because what these guys have done is they've decided that, hey, we can make our food centrally, ping it, send it in a vacuum pack to the stores, and just have some student on a part-time job ping them at the microwave. Now I can just get little extra, whatever it is, microwave meals and ping that at home. And also Deliveroo and Just Eat hasn't really helped with those sort of business models. So it makes you think that yes, some of these restaurants are failing, but they're not all failing in a particular area. So what is the reason why one business model is working and another business model is not working? It's a very similar thing when you're looking at a residential tenant. If someone is an Uber driver, you may consider whether, if that's their only source of income, whether they're best tenant for your property, as opposed to being in a full-time job, a teacher, or what have you. So you see these people failing, but what successful property investing is about matching the right tenant with the right property. This is an ad from the Estates Gazette last week. Half-page ad, Domino Pizzas. They're looking for new sites. They want to open up 80 new properties. And a lot of commercial property is just about finding a site that preferably you can buy empty, which has failed for one occupant, but trying to think how you can match that site with another type of occupant who has a business model that will succeed. A lot of the casual dining sector is failing also because of high business rates. The bigger the space you occupy, particularly on a retail unit, the more business rates you pay. Now, if your restaurant is half full, then the business rates are going to disproportionately affect your margins for that particular shop. Now, these sort of takeaway outfits, they don't use as much space as the big restaurants. So their turnover per square foot, again, it's a square foot thing, their business model allows a higher turnover per square foot, which means their business model is more sound, and they're probably going to be a better and safer and more secure tenant to have in your commercial property going forward. Does that make sense to people? Yeah? So the opportunity, when you combine, and it's about combining a lot of different opportunities and strands. So there's a whole bunch of permitted development that has come in, which allows conversion of and space to the rear or of former commercial properties like retail units into residential use. You know, so it's quite conceivable to pick up a failed A3 restaurant unit, find a tenant that wants to occupy it for a takeaway type of unit, get the change of use planning, which should be straightforward because it's a very similar usage, and chop the oversized shop into making a residential unit under PD with the excess space. Does that make sense? So it's about cutting and slicing all these strategies and figuring out what's going on in the world and how you can join all the things that you can do to come up with an angle, to be innovative and to make some sense out of this whole thing. And as I said, I mean, I think really you're matchmakers in commercial property. Because the thing about residential property is that it's relatively straightforward to see the angles on a 3-bedroom semi. If you see an empty, derelict commercial unit, it sometimes can be difficult to imagine what it could be. And some of these slides that Anne showed, like in the former cinema hall, it takes imagination to think of what that space can be. So the golden rules, if you like, find the right business, read the financial press, find out who's expanding, who's growing, and who's looking for sites, and what sites they're looking for. Match those with property opportunities that you see. Maximise your understanding of things like permitted development rules so you can reconfigure the space to make residential sort of use of some of the excess space. Okay, that was more or less all I wanted to add.